The video game of Steven Spielberg's E.T. is considered to be one of the worst of all time and has even been blamed for triggering the collapse of Atari. Scott Warshaw, the gifted programmer who made it, explains how it was rushed out in a matter of weeks, and how he feels about those events in California now. Spielberg was unimpressed. "Couldn't you do something more like Pac-Man?" he asked. It was July 1982 and Atari, then one of the world's most successful tech companies, had just paid a reported $21 million for the video game rights to Spielberg's new blockbuster, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Scott Warshaw was the programmer tasked with designing the game. "I was stunned," says Warshaw. "Here was Steven Spielberg, one of my idols, suggesting that I knock off the game. My impulse was to go, well, gee, Steven, couldn't you make something more like The Day the Earth Stood Still?" Warshaw's stock was high at Atari. The 24-year-old had just finished the video game of Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark, and saw Spielberg considered Warshaw a certifiable genius, and 36 hours earlier Warshaw had been hand-picked for their next collaboration. "It was a day that will live in infamy in my life forever," says Warshaw. "I was sitting in my office and I get a call from the Atari CEO. He said, 'Howard, we need the E.T. video game done. Can you do it?' And I said, 'Absolutely, yes I can.' Games for the Atari 2600 were distributed on cartridges that took weeks to manufacture. If E.T. was to be in the shops for Christmas, Warshaw had a tight deadline. The CEO goes, 'We need it for the 1st of September. That left 5 weeks to do it. Normally it'd be 6 to 8 months to do a game, not 5 weeks. Then he said, 'Design the game and on Thursday morning, be at the airport and there will be a Learjet waiting to take you to see Spielberg.' I'm not sure exactly what I was full of, but whatever it was, I was overflowing with." Warshaw drew up his pitch to Spielberg, and traveled from the Atari headquarters in Sunnyvale, California to Los Angeles. His idea was an adventure game in which the player had to help E.T. phone home by collecting components to make an interplanetary telephone. The player would have to dodge government agents and scientists in order to complete the mission. "I got down to Spielberg and I laid out the whole design," he says. "I told him, I think it's really important that we do something innovative. E.T. is a breakthrough movie and I think we need a breakthrough game." I talked him out of the idea of a Pac-Man knockoff. But the key was to design a game that I could deliver in 5 weeks. Atari needed E.T. to be a hit. In 1982 sales had reached a peak of $2 billion, but the company was losing market share to home computers like the Commodore 64, which could do more than play games. "It was the hardest I've ever worked on anything in my life," says Warshaw, who was the game's sole programmer. "I started working at the office, but after a while I realized there was a problem. I still have to go home to sleep and eat occasionally. So we had another development system installed in my house so that I would never be more than 2 minutes away from working on the code except when I was driving. There was a manager who was assigned to make sure I was eating so that I'd be able to keep going. When it came to the end of the process, my reaction was, wow, I did it." Atari ordered an initial run of 4 million copies and budgeted a reported $5 million on what would be, at the time, the biggest ever advertising campaign for a video game. "E.T. needs help from his human friend, and that's you. Read the magazine ad." Television commercials ran for weeks. Spielberg himself appeared in a promotional video, whilst Warshaw was flown to the London premiere of E.T. and given a seat in front of the Princess of Wales. "The bosses believed that as long as we put anything out the door with E.T.'s name on it would sell millions and millions," he says. To begin with, the game was right up there on the Billboard top sellers, but word began to spread that there were serious problems. "It was a finished game, but it certainly wasn't perfect," Warshaw says. "There were too many opportunities where you could suddenly wind up in an odd situation. That was too much for a lot of people and caused them to put the game down. Players complained that the E.T. character would inexplicably fall into pits and get stuck. As one 10-year-old told the New York Times, "It wasn't fun." Atari soon realized that E.T. was not going home. In early December 1982 it announced disappointing sales for the year and the value of its parent company Warner Communications plunged. The results triggered steep drops in the value of other video game makers. After the Christmas season it was starting to come back from retailers, says Warshaw. It still sold nearly 1.5 million units, but when you needed to sell 4 million, that's not good enough. By the second quarter of 1983, Atari's parent company announced losses of $310 million. Things just started to unravel, says Warshaw. It's awesome to be credited with single-handedly bringing down a billion-dollar industry with 8 kilobytes of code. But the truth is a little more complex. Consumers were turning to the home computer and the market was saturated with video games. In a bid to avoid collapse, prices, and much of the workforce, were slashed. But it was futile and in July 1984 Warner offloaded Atari for $240 million. "I took some time off to recover from the whole experience," says Warshaw. "I went into real estate for a couple of years and hated it. Eventually I went back to technology, returning to video games as a manager and director, but it had lost the charm by then." Creatively unfulfilled, Warshaw undertook projects in writing and TV production. "I knew I was done with the industry but I couldn't envision an alternative. I became depressed." Warshaw's solution was to throw reason to the wind and in 2008 he retrained as a psychotherapist. "Maybe a part of me really wanted to compensate for all the trauma and depression I created with the E.T. game," he says. "But in reality it's something I always wanted to do." Today Warshaw bills himself as the Silicon Valley therapist, fluent in both English and nerd. Does he use his own story of colossal failure with clients? "Sometimes I do," he admits. "But every therapist uses their own experience with their clients. To me it's a very natural thing. Programmers and therapists are all systems analysts. It's just that I've moved on to a much more sophisticated hardware." In April 2014 Warshaw was given his own chance to obtain closure on the E.T. fiasco. A film company was making a documentary about a legend that had persisted for 30 years, that in 1983 Atari had buried truckloads of the unsold E.T. games in the New Mexico desert. "I never believed it, I just thought it was absurd," says Warshaw. The city of Alamogordo granted permission for a public excavation to take place. Warshaw was invited to attend. "When we arrived, there was a long line of fans from all over the country who had traveled to see this," he says. "It was an odd thing to sit there and literally watch your past being dug up." The excavation confirmed that Atari products were indeed buried at the dump and Warshaw was filmed at the moment a battered and crushed copy of E.T. was pulled from